Hi, I'm Jerry Sparks, president of AG Financial Insurance, and once again we have Rich Hammar, legal counsel to the General Counsel of the Assemblies of God. And we have a special guest with us today. Carter McDaniel is the church administrator here at Central Assembly of God, and Carter, glad to have you aboard with us today.
Well, thanks, Jerry. It's great to have you guys here at Central.
We're going to talk a little bit more about church fraud, where we talked about it last month, but kind of just do a follow-up, and it's great to have a church administrator here, so we're talking about church fraud, and this happens to be a nice, large church, and we would like to have your intake on this. So anytime we have any questions or make a comment, you have something, just jump right on in.
All right, Jerry.
So what we're going to do is talk about a little bit about the internal controls and what churches should do. We're going to do a follow-up, kind of summarize where we were at last week. And really the internal controls we set up are how a church should handle their cash and the church assets to reduce the risk of theft or mismanagement. So Rich, why don't you go through and we'll just kind of summarize some of the internal controls that we put together or talked about last month at our webinar.
Okay, let's do that. And as I go through these, I have 13 that I'm going to mention quickly. These are kind of the key components of internal control. We use the term internal control. In a technical sense, of course, it just means having proper oversight over the handling of cash as well as church assets, and to ensure accountability. And there are a number of things that can be done to ensure a competent system of internal control, which in turn will reduce greatly the risk of financial fraud. So we went over these last week. I'm going to mention them quickly again today, and you gentlemen both can comment on these. If you can think of something you can say that will amplify these points. So the first one, these are not in any order, by the way. The first one is, of course, to have more than one person count the church offering. I know what you're thinking. How could a church have one person count the offering? You know, Bob's back in that locked office every Sunday counting the offering. How is this possible? Let me tell you how it's possible. Church leaders don't want to offend people. And if we tell Bob, you know, we think there ought to be a second person counting that offering, you mean I've been doing this for 25 years by myself and now you're accusing me of wrongdoing? And so church leaders recoil from that confrontation and allow Bob to continue counting that offering. So that's how it happens.
Yeah, I think Rich, you know, on a lot of these we're going to see a key concept is having multiple people involved. I think sometimes it's easy to think, you know, it'll streamline the process if we have one person count the offering and do the deposit, and kind of one person is kind of our go-to person. But it's a key concept here to have multiple people involved in the process. Sometimes that takes a little bit longer, and it's a little more challenging to lead multiple people through those steps, but it always makes things safer.
Yeah, it's what CPAs refer to as a division of responsibility. And by dividing responsibility, you greatly ensure and contribute toward an internal control type of environment.
You know, one of the things that I would say is that we should have the people that you have counting should both be unrelated. So number one, they're unrelated.
Not a husband and wife?
Not a husband and wife. But then also rotate weekly, if you can, the counters of monies with different individuals, so you don't have the same person doing it every week. So if you've got enough people in your church where you can do this, so if you have less money coming in all the time during one person counting, you're going to actually probably notice it, and they're going to notice it because of the division of duties.
Yeah, and that's the second point that I would make, having a pool of counters that you randomly rotate. And then the third point is making sure that at least two persons collect the offering. You say, well, how does that happen? Well, in some churches that have balconies, now think about this. You may have an usher up there, one usher sometimes, collecting the offering and bringing those plates or bags down the stairway that's isolated and unsupervised down to the floor, ultimately to a counting room. And that money is unsupervised. It's unaccountable for that period of time. And I know of a number of cases where people have, in fact, embezzled funds under those circumstances. So you want to have two people involved in counting, and not just counting, but carrying offerings to the counting room.
One of the things that a church can also do is actually have church envelopes for their members. And that way, if people, number one, put cash in an envelope, it's not easily accessible to somebody that is in a balcony, number one. Number two, it also makes sure that people get the giving credit for that cash that they give.
Yes, and offering envelopes, let me make an important point here. They are not legally required to substantiate contributions. There's a widespread misconception. We've got to use offering envelopes. or your contributions are not going to be tax deductible. That's nonsense. You don't need to use them, but there are reasons why you would want to. It does greatly reduce the risk of fraud. That's number one. Now let me mention some of the other ones we looked at last week, gentlemen. Offering counts are submitted to the person who deposits the offering. Again, different persons should be counting and depositing the offerings. The next point, number 5 on my list of what we covered last week, the offering counts and bank deposit slips are not regularly reconciled. A sixth weakness would be only one signature needed to write a check. Most of the cases of church embezzlement that I have reviewed, out of dozens, scores of them, most of them come, I would say a lot of them, maybe not most, come down to this one point: sole signatory authority on the church checking account. And I'm not opposed to a church maybe having sole signature authority for one person for checks of up to a certain amount, but I would make that a very low amount. In fact, I'm opposed to it in general.
Right.
I know some churches make it checks above 500 or below 500 don't have to have a second signature. I don't agree with that. So, but having a second signature, to me, it's one of the fundamental postulates of internal control.
One of the things that I'll just follow up on that, have your signature card at the bank also, that if you have a certain amount, like it requires 2 signatures to have any check over $100, that signature card is on at the bank, so the bank does know that requirement is in place.
Yes, and here I might bring up another point, and that is the risk of using digital signatures or signature stamps. Many churches use them, and there have been cases of embezzlement. We talked about one last month where an individual embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from his church. He was a financial volunteer or employee, actually, and he was able to have unrestricted access to digital signatures of all the officers of the church, and he was able to increase the church's line of credit, ultimately leading to misappropriation of funds of close to $1 million. So if you use digital signatures or signature stamps, just be aware that that is a major risk that you encounter. Any comments, gentlemen?
No, go ahead.
Members, yeah, we talked about offering envelopes. Contribution receipts are not issued to members. Most churches, I think, do issue contribution receipts quarterly, semi-annually, sometimes annually. Those are very important, and it's very important for you to encourage church members, donors, to examine those receipts from the church. This is the church's records, and if your records don't correspond to that, if you have records of donations of greater than what the church's receipt is showing, that's a red flag right there of potential misappropriation of church funds. So encourage people to look for discrepancies and to report them to church leadership. Another weakness in internal control is offerings are not deposited immediately. Obviously, offerings should be deposited promptly with the bank.
I would also say have the checks stamped for deposit only once you get them, so have somebody stamp them for deposit only so they can only go into the church's bank account.
Yes, good. We mentioned that last month. Monthly bank statements are not reviewed by someone having no responsibility for handling cash. That's another weakness in internal control. Obviously, you want to have those statements reviewed by an employee or church officer having no responsibility for handling cash or issuing checks. And then my last one, number 11, was that we mentioned last week, making sure that you do not reimburse employees' expenses without adequate substantiation. This is another major source of financial crimes within churches, is churches or church officers sometimes writing checks to themselves for things that have not been properly accounted for in terms of business purpose. And we mentioned last week the related issue of pastors sometimes thinking that they have been underpaid, and many times they have been because of the economic climate, maybe a downturn in contributions, maybe what the church authorized for salary, the church was unwilling to pay. And so over a number of years, a pastor will just start writing checks to him or herself so that I get what I deserve. Well, that may be what you deserve, but that can be a very serious matter. And this relates again to this issue of making sure that reimbursements from the church are for properly accounted for expenditures that have been authorized by the board.
A couple more things. I would have the counting that we mentioned last time. Counting should be done behind a locked door when they're doing the offerings. And it's great to have a camera overlooking the counting area as long as the people know that there is a camera in the room.
Yeah, there was a case in California, I think we mentioned briefly last time, where a church was actually found liable for having a secret camera in the counting room, where they were looking for the perpetrator of what they perceived to be embezzlement of church funds. And the court said this was likely an invasion of privacy, which is intruding upon the seclusion of an individual in a way that would kind of shock the conscience. And so the point is, let people be aware that just like in a bank lobby, you see the cameras all over the place. And that's just as much a deterrent as trying to hide that camera somewhere where the person can't see it. Because if that's what you're going to do, to try to catch the person, you run the risk of personal liability for the church for invasion of privacy.
You know, Rich, I think the other angle on that too is, we have a camera in our counting room and we use multiple teams. We do a lot of these controls we've talked about with regard to the offering. And sometimes when you first put those things in place, the counters can say, well, what do you not trust me? Well, it's as much of a factor of protecting the counter and the people that are involved as it is protecting the church's funds, because if something were to come up missing, it protects those individuals that are involved to be able to say clearly it wasn't Bob in the offering room, because Bob has some accountability in place and we can verify that Bob is in the clear. Kind of using that example from earlier.
Just like having a video in the nursery. We've talked about this in other presentations. It's just wonderful forensic evidence to explain why a toddler has suspicious bruises. Was that child molestation? Well, if you have a video, you can replay and you can see the child fell off a stool. Then you can completely eliminate the potential of abuse.
Deposit should be made as soon as possible. Place a deposit in a locked bank bag and place it in a safe if you cannot use the night depository that immediately.
Jerry, one other thing we've started doing here as well is we use a check scanning service. We have a scanner in our accounting area, and we deposit those checks immediately upon receipt. And when the check goes through the scanner, it's deposited at the bank immediately in real time, and then our service retains a copy of that check for 2 years. So it kind of removes that whole, transporting the checks to the bank.
Excellent.
And a layer.
Great point.
A layer there. So that's a great tool for people who want to take advantage of it.
One of the others, do not sign checks in advance. Do not sign blank checks. Invoices and check requests should be marked paid with a date and check number and filed so they don't get paid more than one time. Bank reconciliation should be approved by someone not authorized to sign checks or make the deposits and should be done promptly. One of the things that we see is if you're going to do it a year afterwards, people forget about things, and it's hard to look for checks out of sequence and that sort of thing. So if you do see checks out of sequence, you need to take a look at that, because somebody may take an older check and do something with that. All disbursements will be made with pre-numbered checks and must be accounted for on a weekly basis. So you know the checks that you're using. The signers of checks must not be the person authorizing the expense. So you have, again, a segregation of duties there. Church financial policy in writing. So you have your segregation of powers in writing right to begin with, so everybody knows what's expected of them. And one of the things that we have mentioned is conduct a background check and credit reports on those that are handling the church funds. So how many times have we seen somebody that has a background of doing something before and they do it again because nobody has held them accountable to it? And one thing that we also mentioned that was probably one of the more important things is engage a CPA or an auditor to come in and audit not only your internal controls but your financials, so you have a check and balance there, which gives the congregation a good feeling that they know what they give their money for is being used for that purpose. So that's kind of where we're at. But now let's say, so we've got all these controls in place, but let's say an embezzlement happens. How should a church respond to embezzlement?
Well, in my experience, and I've dealt probably with hundreds of these cases over the years, they fall into two groups. A small minority of churches when they know or suspect a case of embezzlement will immediately contact the local prosecutor, sometimes contact the IRS. That's one way you can respond. But what I found is that probably 95% or more of churches, when they know of or suspect a case of embezzlement, they don't want to turn this person over to the police, to the prosecutor. They don't want to contact the prosecutor. They don't want to contact the IRS. They want to deal with it internally. And this may be a grandmother. You want her to go on the rock pile, like that case we talked about last month, for 8 years for stealing $3,000 from her church? I still think about that woman with that sledgehammer. I could just, where's my grandchildren? It's horrible. So church leaders recoil from this. We're merciful. We want to forgive this person. And so what they typically do is say, well, if you tell us how much you took and you agree to pay it back, sometimes we'll have you sign a promissory note, unsecured, then everything's going to be fine. Well, that's the most common response, Jerry, but let me just mention 4 issues with respect to that response. First, you need to have a good idea of what was taken before you utilize that particular response. It's premised on you knowing what that person took. How do you know that? You're going to take the word of a thief? So what I think you have to do is get a good estimate of what was taken, a reliable, a credible estimate. And the best way to do that is to hire a certified fraud examiner, a CFE. You can go to the Certified Fraud Examiner website and find the nearest CFEs to your location. These are typically CPAs that have forensic training on identifying fraudulent activity and who's responsible and how much was taken. It's not going to be 100% accurate, but it's the best chance you've got of quantifying what was taken without having to rely on the words of a thief. So that's something I recommend. The second point I'd make about this response is if you have that person sign a promissory note agreeing to pay that $50,000 back, just remember that in essence is a loan. And many churches have in their governing documents a provision that requires loans to be approved by the congregation. So you can't even consider this option unless you are prepared in many churches to go forward to the congregation. You can't keep it secret like many church leaders want to do. You got to go to the congregation and explain what has happened. Grandma Smith has stolen $50,000. We don't want to do that. Well, then you have to take this option off the table then. And then the third point I would make is what if the embezzler doesn't pay the money back that she or he has agreed to do? Well, then you're left with the difficult options of informing the prosecutor or taking it to the IRS. And also number 4 is to recognize that the church board each member has a fiduciary duty to the church. You are set apart by the congregation to be leaders, to be representatives of the body. And so you are held to very high standards in the performance of your duties. You are stewards of the church's resources. And to just willy-nilly let somebody walk off having stolen $50,000 from the church, that is unthinkable. And remember, churches as public charities can only expend their finances, their assets, their funds for purposes that are consistent with their exempt purposes. So, how is it consistent with your exempt purposes to forgive a $50,000 debt to an embezzler? It's not. That's a violation of not just a sacred trust of fiduciary duties, but also of your legal and tax duties under the Internal Revenue Code, that your assets are used for exempt purposes.
One of the things that I see...
Let me make one other point.
Okay, go ahead.
And that is this, that your church is financed almost entirely, if not entirely, by charitable contributions from members. What is their expectation? Their expectation is their contributions are... Why are they making the contributions? So that the church can utilize them in the performance and the exercise of its exempt purposes. And to the extent they know what's going on, many members would be offended and outraged that my contributions, or some portion of them, are going to forgive a $50,000 debt to an embezzler. So that's got to be considered as well.
One of the things, and I know that most churches like to err on forgiveness of people and stuff like that, but how many of the lawsuits that we have seen where a person stole from one church, was forgiven from that church, goes to another church and steals again? So you got to realize that if you forgive somebody for stealing and you don't do anything about it, there's a good chance that they go to another church and this happens all over again.
You are facilitating it. There's a line in Timon of Athens, one of Shakespeare's lesser-known plays, where one of the figures says, "Nothing emboldens sin as much as mercy." Nothing emboldens sin as much as mercy. I've never forgotten that line. And it is so true. And there was a case we talked about last month of a church administrator that embezzled $850,000. And the court, in sentencing that guy to 32 years in prison, said they commented on the fact that this guy had embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars in a previous church that decided to forgive him. And the judge said, and that is what facilitated this crime. That judge spoke with derision over how that prior church had handled this.
Absolutely.
You know, Jerry, you mentioned earlier the importance of background checks. Let's say you've taken that approach, Rich, and you're trying to forgive the embezzler. What happens down the road if you get a reference request for that person? What would be the proper way to respond?
Well, and many churches they're fearful of providing references under those circumstances, but you can do so in a way that's legally safe. And the way that, I think the best way to handle that, when you have vital information that you feel it's important for you to share to protect that other congregation where this guy now wants to work in a position involving access to funds anyway, the way to handle that, I think, in a legally safe manner is to agree to provide a reference contingent upon that individual signing a release, releasing you and the former church from any liability for what you share in that reference. And what's going to happen is the pastor of Church B will ask that individual to sign such a release. He won't do it. And that raises the flag up the pole, the red flag of concern. And that's the way it's done today. In a legally safe manner.
So let's say somebody does forgive a debt. Is this considered taxable income to those people because actually they've received that income? Can you talk about some of the tax implications?
So what happens in these cases? 95% plus that hundreds of cases I've worked with, the church doesn't turn it over to a prosecutor or the IRS. They want to forgive the person. They want the person, oh, well, I'll pay it back. They don't know how much was taken, and there's just some ambiguous intent to pay it back. Occasionally there's a promissory note that's signed. But the fact is, the person ends up not honoring the obligation. Almost always that happens. And so then the church leaders wonder, should we they forgive the debt? And is that taxable income? Yes, the forgiveness of debt is a taxable transaction. It's taxable income. And so you have to report the amount of the forgiven debt as taxable income. Now, the problem is, in cases of embezzlement, you typically don't know how much was taken. Even if you have a CFE assisting you, you have a ballpark estimate. Not enough, in many cases, for you to put something on a W-2 or 1099 as to the amount of the income. And so, Jerry, what the IRS recommends in these cases, and I've spoken with the national office on this, is that you file what's called the Form 3949A, 3949-A, which is called an information referral form. You're not expected, you're not required by law to determine exactly what was taken. And since you don't know with exactitude what was taken, you can't report anything on a 1099 or W-2. The IRS, with that form, will initiate an investigation, and ultimately they have resources, they have the power to inspect bank records and to determine with a great deal of accuracy how much was taken, looking at deposits, et cetera. And so that is probably the best option that you've got. That's what the IRS National Office has told me. That's your best option when embezzlement is suspected.
So actually, let's say we've notified, we've had an embezzlement. Let's talk to our insurance agent. So we're going to notify the insurance agent. A lot of people don't know that. Do they have employee dishonesty coverage? So, or what is called an employee dishonesty bond. So that amount of insurance actually does not go year to year. So let's say, for instance, we had $100,000 worth of coverage over the last 7 years. Each year we renewed that bond. And the average theft is over a 7-year period. So they say, well, they stole $100,000 every 7 years. I should have $700,000 worth of insurance because I've got coverage for all that. But there's a little thing in the insurance policies that state the last insurance that is applicable is the one that picks up all the previous years. So again, you might think that you have a lot of coverage, but it's the last policy that's in effect that would have all the coverage. So if you went from $1 million worth of coverage to $100,000 worth of coverage, you're still only going to have that $100,000, even though people may have stolen over a long time. So you need to notify your insurance agent of what's happened. If they have a confession, give the confession to the insurance company. Your insurance company will pay you, but here's something that a lot of people don't understand when it comes to insurance companies. They have to be willing to prosecute the perpetrator. If you're not willing to prosecute, you're not going to collect your insurance. So if you're going to buy the insurance, you better be willing to prosecute.
Let me address, in our closing minutes here, one other very, very important issue that comes up in all these cases. This is one of the main reasons churches contact me when they know of a case of embezzlement. And the question is, how do we inform the staff? How do we inform the congregation? Here's a person that's been a faithful member or employee of the church for maybe decades, highly respected, and now all of a sudden, this person has been removed from his or her position within the church, maybe even membership within the church, and people are asking questions. What happened to this person? And church leaders often are fearful of responding, are reluctant to respond, they're reticent because they fear that liability. We're going to get sued for defamation. Let me share a few comments about this with you. Number one is the important principle of qualified privilege. And the courts have said almost uniformly that when you share information in a church with members only on matters of common interest to the membership of the church, you are clothed with a qualified privilege, meaning you can't be liable for what is communicated under those circumstances unless you do so maliciously, meaning you share information that you know is false, which hardly ever happens. So the key here is you can have an informational meeting of the members of the church, and you've got to take steps to ensure that only members, in fact, are present. I would recommend that it not be recorded, because that could fall into the hands of non-members. And so the First Amendment guarantee of religious freedom provides an important protection to you under those circumstances in sharing factual information, not opinions, not assumptions, not inferences, but factual information. That's a very important point to keep in mind. If you're going to share with the congregation, be sure you do so only to members of the church. Number two, I recommend you get a signed confession from the individual that includes a statement that you can read this confession to the congregation. I've utilized that approach in many cases. When the person is confronted and confesses, at that moment, there's an opportunity for you to have the person sign a confession. They're contrite, they're embarrassed, they're ashamed, they're guilty. And if you have I recommend you have the document, the confession, in advance prepared, so you can just flip it across the table. They'll sign it, believe me. I've seen this happen countless times. Now, let me make one other point here, and that is that sometimes a person will come and speak to the pastor and confess. Maybe you didn't even know that there was embezzlement going on. Somebody comes to the pastor, a staff member, a bookkeeper, and says, "Pastor, I just can't live with myself anymore. I've embezzled $10,000 or $50,000, $100,000 from the church." You've got to be very careful with that information. If it's communicated to the pastor in a privileged conversation, by that I mean shared with the pastor in confidence, acting in his professional capacity as a spiritual advisor, which is true in many of these confessional cases, you just can't take that information to the board. In fact, that happened in one case, and a church was found liable for a substantial amount because a church financial employee did communicate to the pastor that she had stolen $50,000, and the church was found liable for much more than that because the pastor had breached that duty of confidentiality by disclosing that information to the board. So if you receive information in the process of a confession that's protected by the clergy privilege, do not share that with anybody without that person's, I would say, written permission. Now, that doesn't mean you stop the investigation. You can still pursue the investigation. You know who this person is guilty. You can find evidence by other means, but you can't use that confession. And let me just make one final statement here, and that is, we've talked about audits before. We talked about audits last week. But I just want to emphasize again the importance of a CPA audit of your church financial statements in reducing the risk of embezzlement, and that happens for at least three reasons. Number one, it provides an atmosphere of accountability that is a deterrent to embezzlement. In other words, if you're thinking of stealing money because of lax internal controls in the church, and you know the church has an annual audit, you're fearful that, hey, maybe the church leadership doesn't know what's going on, but a CPA firm will, and they're going to connect the dots to me. So it is a powerful deterrent just having a CPA audit annually, number one. Number two, the CPA firm will assist you in their management letter to develop strong systems of internal control that will reduce the risk of financial impropriety. And furthermore, number three, a CPA firm doing an audit will look for evidence of fraud. That's part of the audit process. And so for these reasons, a CPA audit of your financial statements is incredibly important. I know it can be expensive. We talked about that last week. It's the price of accountability. And for many churches, it's something that I strongly advise. And we mentioned last week, don't confuse an audit with limited engagements, such as reviews or compilations, which don't provide most of these protections that I've just mentioned.
Well, we're once again out of time. What a great time. You know, for additional information on church financial handling, we now have available an ebook at agfinancial.org that will help you with this. So any information that you need and everything that we've covered here is available online at agfinancial.org. Rich, thank you for your time. Carter, thank you for your time. We'll see you next month at Risk Management Live. Thanks, Carter.